So this session, as you know, is about the parish of GAIRLOCH, a very important parish for our Clan MacLennan. The research has been done by Liz Forrest, who is with us today. We're lucky to have with us. And Liz has done a lot of local history work in GAIRLOCH, is a trustee of the GAIRLOCH Museum. And in particular, she is spending a lot of her time researching Scots who went to Patagonia and other parts of South America in the 1800s and into the next century. And so Liz brings a lot of experience to this, this topic, as well as doing the research for this paper today. So I'd like you to welcome Liz, and as we start today, we will share the presentation. And Liz is going to remind me if I forget to hand over to her. So as usual, we will be looking at the old statistical account as a basis for thinking about what life was like for ordinary people in the 1790s. And to that extent, we'll look at the amazing topography, the beautiful topography of GAIRLOCH, where it is, how big it is, what the people are like, the numbers who live there, and the sort of things they might do to earn some income there, what their morals are like, what, how many poor we find there, what their health, housing, diet, those sorts of things. We'll look at a few McLennans who lived there at this sort of time in the late 1700s and thereabouts. And we'll look at the minister and the heritors, the lairds of this parish, and a couple of idiosyncrasies, you know, curiosities. So this is the old statistical account first page. This parish had its name originally from a very small loch near the church and the house of Flowerdale. It says there in the statistical account. The small loch that gives the name to this parish is GAIRLOCH, which means the short loch. It's a sort of stumpy loch, you might say. And that's what Daniel McIntosh, the minister who was there at the time, and we'll learn more about him later, but he's not one of these blow-ins like we saw in some of the other parishes. He's the local person who knows the local people well, including the lairds and the ordinary folk. He wrote this in 1792. So just looking at where it fits into the whole picture of Scotland as a whole, I'll just turn on my pointer. This is GAIRLOCH in here. And you'll remember that a couple of sessions ago, we dealt with Loch Broom, which shares a border along here. We're Conton, a big part for McLennans generally. And we haven't done Applecross yet, but that's in our sights to do that. Loch Carron we did very early in this year, and Loch Alsh we've done recently. So these are places that we're familiar with. Overall, it's one of the 4 largest parishes in Scotland. By comparison, it's actually a bit smaller than Loch Broom, which is indeed a very large parish. Loch Broom is 1,100 square kilometres. This parish is 812 square kilometres, so it's about like 3/4 the size of Loch Broom, which is how you could imagine there. But it's significantly larger than, say, Loch Carron that we saw earlier, which is like about a third of this parish, and indeed Loch Alsh is even smaller. This is the picture of the loch that gives it the name, this little stumpy loch here. Not much to it, is there really, when you look at it like that? And it's said to be so close to the so small that it gets covered by the sea when the tide comes in. Not sure quite what that means, but this is where the harbour is today, as you can see there. Looking at an aerial photo of the whole of Ross Shire mainland, you can see some of these other parishes over here that we've looked at recently, like Dingwall was our last meeting, and also Inverness and along through Nairn. You can see how much more cultivated this area is by comparison with GAIRLOCH over here. That we're, you know, is obviously less cultivated, and we'll see that a bit further in a short time. The key features to point out, this is the short loch in here that we saw a photo of a minute ago. This is the Loch Marie that you've seen in the advertising that we've been putting out. So these are sort of key features that help you to get your orientation here. And this is called Loch Ewe up here. So this continuation of the river coming down here, this Loch Marie through here, the River Ewe between Loch Marie and Loch Ewe is a notable feature of this part of the world. You can see the other parishes, how they relate. And down here you've got Torridon, and the Applecross is really more relates to this part of the world. So Applecross is the whole peninsula, covers that area there. Okay, moving on, we're focusing in a little bit closer, and I've got to warn you, these places that you're going to hear about now will be on the exam, right? Yeah, that's for sure. A couple I tell you they won't be on the exam. I'll give you a tip, but you know, these are certainly on the exam. So looking at this same graphic in a little bit more detail, I photoshopped out those 4 dots just so you don't get confused. Tell me if I'm gone too far, Liz.
No, you're fine just now.
And so we've got Loch Maree here again. You can see there are some islands in the middle of Loch Maree, and it's up to 1 mile across in some parts. That's a key feature. Then you've got this little river, and you've got Pool U in here, and you've got Loch U in here. Some of the places on Loch U are Melon Charles. There are quite a few McLennans we find there in Melon Charles. So this one here, Alt Bay, is a separate place, and it's sort of this little headland here. Today there's a thing called McLennan Field there. It's a football pitch, soccer. And then you've got this place, Laird. We're going to talk about Laird and other names that you see up around that part of the world quite often today. So just keep that in mind. That's an exam certainty, that one. And then you've got GAIRLOCH. This is GAIRLOCH, the village that's there. Of course, this is GAIRLOCH, the parish we're talking about here. Moving back down Loch Maree, this whole thing here is Loch Maree. You've got Kinloch U, which simply means the head of the loch, you know, the continuation that is Loch U, despite there being a river in the middle. And then you've got this area up here, which is up this little valley you can see in here from Kinloch U, which is called the Heights of Kinloch U, or you might call it the Braes. It's more like Braes than Heights really in a way, but that's what it's called. And you can see here how it's you know, bordered on these places we saw before. Dundonald in here, remember, that we saw a couple of meetings ago, and Ullapool up here, which we've seen not that long ago. And the border, really the key features are that you've got a mountain range very close, a range of mountains very close to the northeast, I suppose you'd call it, of Loch Maree. And then you've got another mountain range along parallel to that, which actually in places the border between Loch Broom and GAIRLOCH runs along the peaks of those mountains, and then comes down here and comes along this side here. And then at Dybbeg, we were talking about earlier, the border meets Loch Torridon here and comes around the whole sea coast. So this bit from here inland is part of Applecross, including the coast. So on a map that I looked at to see whether Dybbeg was in GAIRLOCH or in Applecross, it had the most of the letters of Dybbeg in GAIRLOCH, and the G was in Applecross. That tells you where the border runs, okay? And these are quite a big mountain range along here. So you've got the 3 mountain ranges, 1, 2, 3 along the bottom. That's the sort of the key features. I think I mentioned most of those, but there are a couple of others that I can hint won't be on the exam, and that's, well, it could be letter U I didn't mention, you see, that's one that a bit of a dark horse. But Taladale, which is here, we might mention a bit in our talkings, and that's just down here. And also Kernsary, which is up here, just where that little loch is there. Okay. Now this is a picture, you know, that's a photo, isn't it? Liz's photo, that is. Pretty good.
Thank you. As
you weren't plane sick or anything when that happened?
No, even when it went sideways. You're pirouetting on one wing to take photographs out of the window. No, that was fun. I see this is Loch Maree, and you can see the elevation of the land doesn't really give itself to much agriculture. There's woodland along the northeast side of Loch Maree, which will become important later on. And the big mountain on the left of the picture is Slioch. You can see the road very, very well on the right of the picture. And if you squint at the screen, you can see a little squiggly line that leads up to the horizon. We'll come on to that in the next slide. But Loch Maree itself has got 24 little islands on it, and really the only arable land is around the coast of the previous map and also around the head of Loch Murray at Kinloch. And the name Kinloch is actually when Loch Murray was called the Fresh Loch, which is back in the 1600s. So not that long ago. But the name got changed around about the Reformation, I believe, to retain the name of St Melrua, who we'll also mention a bit later on. Next slide, please, Bruce.
There you go.
Thank you. That's Glendochety looking down in the opposite direction to what as we saw last. And
the valley to the heights goes in here, yeah?
Yeah, it sneaks off to the right. And this is the new road. It's the third incarnation of that road, and it was completed in 2005. The previous road was single track with passing places, if some of you might remember that. But this road was only put in the late, well, around about the mid 1800s. Prior to that, the Drove Road from the west to the east went down through the heights. Okay, could I have the next slide, please, Bruce?
Yep, that's it.
And that's the aerial shot from the other end. As you can see, that the arable land at the end of Loch Murray, it's not very much, but it's worked. Thank you. Did you have a piece of music there, Bruce, at all?
No.
You don't, right. Okay, the next slide is from Campbell's map of 1790. As you can see, there are two roads, one each side of the loch, and also a road out to Diabeg and beyond to the overside. However, although these are roads, I wouldn't take that as being, they're more ephemeral, I would say, on the ground at this time. You could probably walk a horse along it. You couldn't take anything with wheels along it. And so they're more indications of this is the easiest way through the mountains, because most of the land is pretty high mountains, as Bruce said, and it takes a while to get through. Okay, the next slide, please, Bruce. And that's just another map of the same, with GAIRLOCH itself, the village being indicated, the church.
And Flowerdale too, you can see there. And
Flowerdale, yes, it's got Flowerdale marked on there as well.
And the islands.
Okay. Now over to you, I believe, for the next.
Oh.
Bruce.
This is a picture looking from around past GAIRLOCH. So we're going, you know, I'm driving around here, and you take this look down this way, and this is what you see. You know, this is the mountain range at the bottom here, with Loch Torrid on the other side. And this out here is Ben A, which is they call it the monarch of the mountains. You know, the one that dominates from all directions, you might say. Beautiful, isn't it? Sunny day. This is when Liz took me for a walk up into the heights. I took this photo. I guess the road's a bit better than it was in the 1790s, but you know, it's an area where you have to walk to. You can't drive in there, or the estate people do, but it's a big gate. Are they fairly agreeable to people walking there if you just turned up, Liz, or you have to book or tell them you're coming? Or
No, this is Scotland. You can walk everywhere.
Yeah, but the gate's pretty serious gate, isn't it?
Well, there's a snicket gate at the side that
right. Okay.
Just yeah, you can go through.
And this is being looking down through the heights towards that mountain range. It's an interesting perspective, actually. That's not snow on the top. But you can see here how little the arable parts of the land are. I think that's an important thing. And the old statistical account talks about how there are many rivers and no bridges. This is reinforcing Liz's point about, you know, you wouldn't want to drive anything with wheels along those so-called roads on that previous map. Only passages for horses. A lot of McLennans lived in this part up here behind where I took this photo from. Heaps of McLennans. It was, you know, almost dominated by them. I read in Liz's book. And so you might like to think, what are the income earning opportunities for people in this part of the world, having just had a bit of a squiz at the topography before we move off it. Anybody like to hazard a guess? Turn your mic on and give me a few clues.
Photography.
Huh?
Photography. I know your brother made me stop quickly all through there to take photos.
In the 1790s, there was a bit of a, you know, early embryonic photography.
Once there were sheep, there were shepherds.
Shepherds. Yeah, there weren't any sort of sheep runs in any extent though at that time. I don't know who it was said that.
Crofting or fishing.
Yeah. James,
Crofting or fishing?
Fishing, yeah, that's it. I think you might find some opportunity in fishing. Okay, so let's talk about how many people lived there, if you could turn your mics off again. We're up to slide number. I've got to be careful here, Liz. Still okay, am I? Okay.
Yeah, it's happy to go.
The number of what are called examinable persons is quite not that different from Webster's. You know how we look at Webster's 1755 census each time and see how it compares. And in many parishes, we've seen an increase of, you know, like up to 50% on what there was only a generation and a half earlier. But here, in fact, examinable probably means like a catechismal age, you know, like probably over 12 or 10 or 15 or something. So they didn't count the kids. So maybe it's gone up more than it would appear from this information. He just talks about some relatively small numbers there. But what we can say, and a thing that Liz has pointed out in her research, is that it's all very well that there were roughly 2,000-ish in 1800-ish. But by 1831, there were 4,500 people living there. This, you know, for a place that's not got much arable land, that's a huge increase. It's more than doubled in the 30-odd years from this time till then. So maybe they just counted better or whatever, but you got to think this is a lot of pressure on the land then by 1841. Liz has kindly pointed out the years for which, you know, how a lot of these old parish records, OPRs as we call them, and often are not available for different parishes because they were never kept, or they got lost, or they, you know, fell in a river when a minister was taking it out to baptize some child, got washed away, whatever. So Liz has kindly pointed out the years here that you can get records, and it's interesting to note that in some periods there was a separate sub-parish, you might call it, of Pool U. You remember Pool U was on the exam questions there? But of course, as with any other, almost all other parishes in the Highlands, there were no death records or burial records in this parish, as you might expect. Produce. I'm getting worried, Liz, whether it's you. No, this is me.
No, it's still you.
So, you know, overall, we've got to think about what was available for earning income. And he does say that the hills afford good pasture for different kinds of cattle. And so that is something that we see elsewhere as well. So cattle rearing, black cattle, that is, of course, is a normal sort of activity, and they could drive them across to the markets, and then they'd be driven down to markets in as far as Yorkshire or even further. And he says GAIRLOCH has been for many ages famous for cod fishing. You'll see later what sort of quantities are involved. Also, for time immemorial, remarkable for herring fishing. So James, you're on the right track there. He says then that looking at the local people's own interests. He says that farmers plant potatoes and they catch fish, and that contributes much to their support. So they, you know, like we saw in some other parishes, the diet consists primarily of potatoes and fish. The oats are sown in spring, as you might expect, March to April, beginning of April. Barley is sown a little bit later. Barley, he says, our latest barley is seldom the worst for part of the crop when summer proves warm and showery. So, you know, it's barley can be good, but maybe not. The harvest begins in August and goes till early October. He says, our crop frequently suffers much from shaking winds attended with heavy cold rain about the autumnal equinox. Oh dear. So you can see that it's precarious to grow grain anyway in this part of the world. Oats and potatoes planted about the same time. He says, when the season's favourable, the crops are by no means bad, yet this is a really important thing. Now, if you're looking for an exam question, this is the obvious one. In this parish, they almost never can grow enough to support themselves. He says that even if the season is favourable, they can what they can grow is scarcely enough for them to use for 7 or 8 months only. You know, quite a lot of the year they have to buy in grain. That's what that says to me. So, and he says that, you know, vessels come from near and far to sell meal, as it's called, you know, grain, at what you might think of as extravagant prices. I think that's about 8 stone, I think, is about 50 kilos. Someone else might be better at the calculations than I am, but someone today worked out there was about the weight of a, you know, a normal sort of provisions bag. I think fertilizer used to come in 50 kilo bags. And for that, they would have to pay 16 shillings, which is quite a lot by comparison with their daily pay rate that we'll see. Okay. Are we there yet? Liz?
Yeah, we're there. Thank you very much, Bruce. The other main produce earlier than we're looking at is iron ore. Iron workings iron has been made throughout the parish, well, since the Iron Age, really, gives a bit of a clue. But the iron was very low grade that was available locally. It was mostly from bog iron and iron pans, which are a deposit within the peat, like water percolating down that picks up iron, is iron rich, and then solidifies in an iron pan and within the bog of bog iron. So it's very low grade, and so the industry couldn't develop with such low grade iron. However, what it did have, as you're probably, as I pointed out on the slide of Loch Maree, there was a lot of woodland along the northeast shore of Loch Maree, and that's the deciding factor, really, because the oak was burned to make charcoal, and the charcoal is very friable to transport, even by water. So the iron workings were set up along that shore, and the main person who introduced the industry was Sir George Hay. Now, he's an interesting chap. He is sometimes in favour with the Crown and sometimes not in favour with the Crown. But one time when he was in favour, he was granted a licence to make iron ore and cut the trees for charcoal, because they weren't used to make boats for war. So he was able to cut those. He had estates in Fife on the east coast, and he also had connections with London when he was in favour with the Crown and was going to court. The industry developed from a domestic setting to a more commercial setting when blast furnaces were introduced. Now they came in from Germany and they developed in the southeast part of England in the Weald of Kent, and workers from there were imported to Wester Ross to work for Sir George Hay on his blast furnace technology. So these furnaces predate Bonor in Argyllshire by about 100 years. You're moving me on.
Yep, sorry, yep, go on. Whoop.
Okay.
Do you move on? Yes.
I will do. In the old statistical account, we have no mention of sheep. Now, this was just before the first sheep farms were brought in letter U. And until 1785, GAIRLOCH estate rents were paid in butter, cheese, and paid in kind. And they're mostly from a cattle economy. The first sheep farm in the GAIRLOCH Parish was around 1795, when a John McIntyre rented the grazing of Smearsery and Slioch on the northeast side of Lochmarie on the Letter U estate. And then in 1800, a cattle dealer from the north of England, John Birtwistle and Sons, rented more extensive lands. And they didn't only take cattle, they also introduced the sheep. And they would drive them not only to Muir of Ord and Falkirk and the bigger fairs in Scotland, they would walk these beasts all the way to Malham in the north of England, in Yorkshire, to great livestock fairs down there. And they had links with farmers all over the Hebrides and the Highlands and Islands. And some years there were 20,000 head of cattle and 10,000 beasts walking from all over Scotland to this great big fair at Malham. Okay, can I have the next slide, please, Bruce?
This is where Liz lives.
Oh yes, looks a bit different from there, but that's Cromaseg, about 1863 in Kinlochew. Are you familiar with the George Washington Wilson photographic collections? Brilliant, brilliant source of old photographs, 1860s, 1870s. Just type in George Washington Wilson and it's Aberdeen Art Gallery, I believe, hold the copyright for that. And the extension on the left-hand side of that byre dwelling may possibly be a corn drying kiln.
Oh, here.
Yeah, that bit. I see there's a little bit of smoke coming out of the chimney. But that might be an old version of what we see a reconstruction of in the next slide.
Which one is your bedroom, Liz?
No, my house is a little bit off the shot on the right hand side.
And can you see the footings of these buildings in your grounds?
You can't see them now. That looks like the last time the croft was ploughed, though. But we've got trees in that part of the croft now. My neighbour's house is the gable end you can see being constructed on that little
here.
house on the right hand side.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's that bit.
Ah.
That's my neighbour's house.
Huh.
That was made about that time.
Wow. Okay.
Next one. So that's the reconstruction at the Highland Folk Museum of a corn drying kiln, and this time a barn, but it looks very similar to what was in the other one, the other slide. Okay, could I have the next slide, please, Bruce?
Yep, there you are.
We're on to the heritors now of GAIRLOCH. they are all Mackenzies at the time of the old statistical accounts, and most of them were residents in the parish, apart from Colonel Mackenzie of Cool, who's whizzing about the East Indies doing military stuff. But you've got to be very careful about your heritors and your sources. One of the major sources for the GAIRLOCH Parish is a fabulous book by a gentleman called Dixon, who was an English gentleman who retired to GAIRLOCH Parish for his health. And he rented a house off one of the Mackenzies. So he was awfully nice about the Mackenzie family. And so his view of them may have been a little bit skewed. But these were the heritors of GAIRLOCH at the time. Okay, do you want to say anything about about Hector Roy, Bruce?
Up to you. It's okay. Yep. Okay. So you know, we need to think about how the Mackenzies came to be here in such big numbers and controlling this part of the world. Well, there's a longer version of this story, but the long and the short of it is that James IV gave a commission of fire and sword to Hector Roy Mackenzie, who was related to the Seaforths, you know, from Eileen Donan fame, to exterminate the MacLeods of GAIRLOCH. These, of course, MacLeods were aligned with the Lord of the Isles, you know, they're of Nordic origin, and you know, the Islay and so on, and they were not in favour of the kings of Scotland, you know, a bit separate, and wanted their own to do their own thing. So the Mackenzies took on the job of ridding the pests out of this part of the world, MacLeods, and it took 100 years to complete that exercise. There's a story about a bloody shirt that was used as a bit of a catalyst for getting it going. Anyway, this is how the Mackenzies grew in their coverage. And of course, you can see then how easy and obvious it would be that McLennans, who were part of the Mackenzie sphere of influence, would come along to help and to reside. And it's no wonder that we finish up with so many McLennans in the parish there. So he was the son of the Alexander, the chief's second wife, Margaret MacDonald. That's an interesting thing. And it was a sort of dastardly thing what they did, going and, you know, hacking up any MacLeod sympathiser they found. That James VI, you know, who we sometimes know as James I, was asked if he would give a sort of remission, like, you know, forgive them for having the lawlessness that they were carrying on when they took over GAIRLOCH. Well, nonetheless, though, you see that by, you know, the times of, let's say, this book that Liz has just referred to, you can see that he dedicates the book to the Lairds, which, you know, consistent with what Liz just told you, and it says on the back here that they've been the Lairds for, you know, some centuries. The current one in the 1880s is the 6th baronet, the 13th Laird of GAIRLOCH. So, you know, it's a long line of Lairds that have been in charge of GAIRLOCH for ever since this event took place. Hector Roy's extermination of the MacLeods. And so this one who's there in the 1770s is the 4th baronet. They got mixed up with being made baronets of Nova Scotia too, I should add. That was part of their, you know, looking after the king's interests. And he lived until 1826, the current Laird, who we're going to talk about quite a bit, Sir Hector Mackenzie, the 4th baronet, was there from 1770 until 1826 with his death. Is this me or you, Liz?
It's you.
This is Port Henderson coming up, right? So one of the things, because you have recognised fishing as being an important thing, it's quite interesting to note that a number of McLennans were there in Port Henderson. I went to see Port Henderson, and it's really quite exciting in a way, maybe. He built Port Henderson in 1815, this Sir Hector, who we just talked about, to encourage the people in the parish to have some source of income. And that was because, as it's said by the Canmore, you know, Canmore's a very credible authority for these sorts of things, a worthy institution in Scotland. And he built this area up as Port Henderson to be a place that could be lived in by people who were short of income and could earn some money from fishing. He named it after his second wife, who's called Christian. That's a girl's name in Scotland. And we know of one John McLennan, who was born in 1804 and was one of the original residents of Port Henderson, him and his family. That's his ID number in our records. And in 1845, the area was set up on a crofting basis, whereby each family got 4 to 5 acres to look at. If you look up this thing, the social history of each croft in Port Henderson, you can get quite a nice story of each of the families who lived there and how it was handed on from one to the next and so on. This is moving now along to the Lairds, continuing our talk about the Lairds. This is the house that we noted on that those earlier maps, the house that was the residence of the Mackenzie Lairds, the baronet, since 1738. So it was well established by the time of this statistical account. I think there was an extension, it's called the eastern end, so that would be this end maybe. Anyway, there's an extension was put on it after the 1790s, but that's the Flowerdale house. And it happens that at the same time, that same family was building what you might call a weekender in Easteros, between Conan Bridge and Muir of Ord. So Conan Bridge was called Conan Village in those days, and you can see that it's got the old spelling. You remember when we looked at one of those parishes, we saw that often the old map spelt the river with an A, and today people would say that's just wrong, you know, that's the wrong spelling, but that's the name of the house because it was built in the 17th. Someone told me it was because there was a typographic error on some map and people took up the new spelling with some enthusiasm. Anyway, today it's spelt with an O, the river, but the house is spelt with a A because that's when it was built. And by the time of Dixon's book, that's this book here that, you know, we're going to talk about so much, it said that the Mackenzies of GAIRLOCH are living half and half in this house and the Flowerdale house. Liz.
Thank you. Looking at agricultural improvement, this is the type of agriculture that was in existence before the crofting scheme was set out. These are a series of rigs. This is just above Big Sand to the north of GAIRLOCH on the coast. And these were allocated to different families on a year-by-year basis. So that a run of rigs, so hence you get the term run rig system. So a rig is a narrow strip of cultivated land. There was no incentive to improve your particular rig because somebody else was going to get it another year. So until the land was reformed and you got a set amount of land, as I say, there was no incentive to cultivate and improve what you had. The estate itself began to be split up because of death duties and requirements for more cash, as some of the lairds had a more lavish lifestyle than they had previously. So Mackenzie of Grignard sold out to Henry Davidson of Tulloch in 1795. And we've heard about Davidsons of Tulloch in previous talks.
Last time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then Davidson sold out to Merrick Banks, and he wasn't such a benevolent landlord. He acquired the Grignard in 1835, and he also bought Letter U around about that time as well. But the Mackenzies of GAIRLOCH have held the majority of the land since the 1490s, and they added Kinlochew in 1743 and Kernsbury in 1844. So the agricultural reform carries on it's just outside our field of interest for today, but it sort of rounds everything off. When Sir Hector died, he was succeeded by his son Francis, who had been abroad and in England to study small-scale agricultural units. He was concerned with keeping people on the land, not so much to make kelp as the estate owners on Lewis were, but just to improve the land and to improve the style of living of his tenants. However, he died before all this could be put into place. His younger brother, Dr. John, took it on with a vengeance. Dr. John had Grignard Island and Isle U, where he set up a model farm, and he translated all these ideas onto the mainland estate as well. He was looking after the estate until Francis's son could take over. And all this happened during what, for a lot of Scotland, we call the period of the clearances. And it's a very emotive term, clearance. It can mean whole-scale cottage burning and shoving people off the land and putting them on boats to wherever. Or it can be suggesting that a tenant move to a different part within the estate for economic reasons for both parties. So there's a whole broad spectrum covered by this, as I say, very emotive term, clearance. GAIRLOCH inheritors were very reluctant to evict anybody. They encouraged people to move if there were greater opportunities elsewhere, but they didn't send in people to shift them and their baggage wholesale, as that I can come across anyway. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is the church in GAIRLOCH. It's the Church of Scotland building. It was built around this time of the old statistical account. According to the Fasti, there was an old church at Kinlochew dedicated to St Mulrua, and that's just a heap of stones by the farm now. There was an island, a pilgrimage in Loch Marie, Isle Marie, and the remains of St Mulrua's chapel there. But there's also Mackintosh said, the Reverend Mackintosh said there was no dissenters, seceders, or any other kind of sect whatever in the parish. All of them were of the established church. The church that was there before this was being built is actually across the road in the graveyard. It was an old building, it was thatched, it was falling down, and very, very ruinous. And the summer of the statistical account, it had begun to be taken down and the new church was in the process of being built. There had been repairs on the old church earlier in the 1700s, but the major heritor, Mackenzie of Gairloch, was liable for 80% of the build. So the church and the manse are not next door to each other. That building behind is the 1970s church hall. The manse is about 6 miles away and said to be in the middle of the parish. It has a nice glebe around about it, which if you know Gairloch, that's now a football field, and this building that's been done on it. However, the minister also, apart from having a glebe and access to agricultural land, had access to salmon from the sea. And the manse bothy is still there on the low road in Gairloch by the beach. So that was available to the minister as well. Can I have the next slide, please, Bruce? The other place of worship within the parish at the time was at Laird. This is the Chapel of Sand at Idrigal. It's medieval and is in use at the time of the old statistical account. Local tradition says it was built at the time of St. Columba in the 7th century, but architecturally that doesn't support it. It's probably a medieval building. There's work afoot to replace the information boards that are there, and also looking into stabilizing some of the structure without removing some of the vegetation that's holding it together. The chapel is marked on all of the old maps and was in use until some part of the 19th century.
It's a beautiful thing, isn't it, to go and visit? You know, if you're traveling through Gairloch, it's such a lovely thing to go there and see. You can really feel in touch with the medieval life, can't you? The priest coming in his boat to do a bit of preaching at the right. Wonderful. That's so fabulous. Lovely. It's such a lovely setting, like a lot of others, but it just captures everything. This is Loch Broom, you can see up here, of course, in the distance, the other side of that. This is on the north side of Gairloch. I had such a success finding the headstone there for that fellow after whom the football pitch is named there in Old Bay. You know, I found it here, just around about here when I took that photo. Roderick. Go on, Liz.
Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So our ministers leading up to Daniel McIntosh. Previous ministers in the parish, Farquhar McRae is an interesting chap. He was brought in to minister to the people who were brought in by Sir George Hay to make the iron at Letter U. Because these people were non-Gaelic speakers, they couldn't have access to the local ministers and who were Gaelic speakers, so they needed somebody who could preach in English. So this chap was brought in. And we've got a Murdo McLennan there, who was also a minister later on in the 1600s. And John Morrison was an interesting chap. He brought Presbyterianism into the Gairloch Parish. It was a struggle because Sir John of Cool was a little bit reluctant to encourage this new form of religion. In fact, he said no Presbyterian should be settled in any place where his influence extended unless Her Majesty's forces did it by the strong hand. So that seems to be an over my dead body phrase. Poor Morrison, Reverend Morrison, had no glebe no manse, no legal maintenance. And he was obliged, it says, to take a tack of land, and that for 3 or 4 years successively, his crops were destroyed by cattle. And in the time of the rebellion, his best cattle were taken away by the rebels and his house plundered of all provisions. So he was desperate to leave, and he was eventually allowed to leave. And Daniel McIntosh, the writer of our statistical account, came in several decades later.
It's interesting to think how what we take for granted now, the Presbyterianism, was so controversial, that this fellow was being rebelled, being locked up as being an interloper, in the 1700s, not long before the statistical account, in fact. Amazing, isn't it? Next slide. Yep.
One other little snippet. I don't know, for you Scottish folk here, do you have midges at the moment? We've got the midge capital of the free world here in Kinlochhew. And one time when this poor gentleman was coming through, he was set upon and tied to a tree, stripped naked. And it was only late in the evening when some old crone managed to untie him and release him, but he'd been feasted on by some of our local wildlife in the form of the midges. So it was a few years before he came back. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, here's our Daniel McIntosh, the writer of the old statistical account. You see, born in 1735 and educated at King's College in Aberdeen. Then he was a missionary in Strathglass. He succeeded John Downey, who had moved on to Stornoway. He married Catherine Mackenzie, daughter of William of Grignard. They had 5 daughters and a son. And he was greatly assisted by Sir Hector Mackenzie and his wife, who stumped up £300 towards the building of the new church. However, he got in bother with presbytery. The minister of Loch Carron complained that Sir Hector had been living with a Jean Urquhart, who was not his wife. And the Reverend McIntosh had done nothing about this. So presbytery came down heavily on poor Daniel McIntosh. He must have had a chat with Hector Mackenzie. It must have been an awkward conversation. I'd like to have been a fly on the wall at that place. But subsequently, 3 children of the couple were brought forward for baptism from that little incident. He died in 1802 and was succeeded by the Reverend James Russell. Could I have the next slide, please?
Yep, there you go.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you get. Sorry, I'm looking at 2 places at once. Character of the people. In general, sober, regular, industrious, and pious. It's a very short description, but looking further into that, he seems to be very happy with his congregation. He doesn't say that they're indolent or unpleasant. He always says that they are very good at hospitality, esteemed for hospitality and civility. New Year's festival is the only festival observed, and not Christmas. Even until recently, Christmas has not been observed in GAIRLOCH Parish. Marriage customs, the night before, washing bride and groom's feet at their respective houses. and after the ceremony, putting the couple to bed. And that in Dixon's, it was saying that it was strictly observed still into the 1870s. Now, recently, we've still got marriage customs here in GAIRLOCH Parish. A recent local couple who were married were subject to a blackening. Do you know what blackenings are? Have you come across that, Bruce? No?
Doesn't sound good.
Well, a modern blackening is in the form of abducting and tying up the happy couple, sticking them on the back of a pickup and driving them round the village, where they are covered in usually a mixture of flour, egg, treacle, soot, beer. If you're a fishing family, it comes to a bucket of fish guts is involved in there. I remember reading in the Free Press, in the small ads in the Free Press, you know, the Hatches, Matches, Dispatches paper pages. So and so and so and so's blackening. Announcement to be arranged. Please bring own materials. And so then the bride and the groom do get scrubbed off, and all of this is washed off before they actually turn up at the altar. But that still happens very rarely now today, but it still happens. The funeral customs, saying a lot of drinking was involved, and carrying the coffin and putting a stone down where every so often coffins are very heavy, so you have to have a change of coffin bearers as you're carrying it from the house to the burial ground. So where you stop, you put a cairn down and then put the coffin on the cairn. Sometimes then you sit on the coffin and pass a bottle round. And the most recent one that was done in that way was the old gamekeeper at Lecky, up at the heights of Kinlochew. A gentleman called Ferguson was the last person to live there, and when he died, his coffin was carried way up into the hills, about 4 or 5 miles where he wanted to be buried, up at the top of Glentannachy. And his coffin was sat on at the places of setting down, and bottles were consumed, and all the empties were put into the cairn that was put on top of his coffin, as well as his details. So there are photographs, I think it's still in the museum, of all the men carrying the coffin up to Glentannachy. So some of these relics of customs are not that old. Could I have the next slide, please?
There you go.
There we go. That's an illicit whiskey still. Some of these McLennans were also involved in whiskey manufacture. And Dixon said it was a mania for distilling illicit whiskey coming into the parish. These stills, you find them up many burns in many streams in the parish. Just a little rocky out constructions. There's a flue, and it's usually close to water, so you can cool the worm where you're distilling your spirit. Often they're against a grey rock outcrop, so the gauges won't see the smoke from the fire. Also, they can also be in a birch wood, so in winter time when there's no leaves on the trees, the white and grey of the branches will look like the smoke, or the smoke will look like the branches. so that it's not given away its location.
So Liz, is this the kiln in here or what?
Yes, that, okay, there's the rucksack and there's a little dark space just behind the rucksack
There?
at 2 o'clock.
Oh,
Yeah.
there? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the entrance to the flue. So the pot would stand in the place behind. It's all covered in moss now.
Hmm. This is in GAIRLOCH somewhere?
That's just up the back of my house.
It's yours, you're saying? Is that what you're telling me?
I couldn't possibly comment. So yeah, these are all over the place.
Yeah.
And Strathconnell probably has the most identified, but that's had the most people investigating them. So they're not just the most there, it's just that people have looked.
Yeah, where my great-great-grandfather grew up was, you know, just that was all they did was make whiskey in the hills of the Strathconnell, Scatwell.
Yes. It's a good occupation, very profitable.
Yeah.
Right, schools. Okay, most people could not read or write. However, they had a great literary tradition, or tradition of story bearing and tradition bearing. Because they couldn't read, they had to remember stories perfectly. So we're terribly lazy nowadays. We just read things and forget them. But if you are in a pre-literate society, then you have to remember what you're told verbatim. The first school in the parish was established in 1730, the parochial school, funded by a combination of the church, the government, and assisted by the Heritors. But Daniel McIntosh was desperately keen to get more schooling for the younger people. And he said there are only 2 catechists who are shared by the 2 neighbouring parishes as well. There was an SSPCK school in GAIRLOCH Parish established in Poolew in 1714. John Robertson was the teacher there, and this became the Poolew Agricultural School in the first half of the 19th century, teaching practical agriculture to children of crofters 1.5 hours a day, and elementary school the rest of the day. It was receiving grants from the Free Church later in the 1800s, as well as being supported by the GAIRLOCH Mackenzies. And now I think that's over to you, Bruce, for the poor.
The poor. Well, there were a lot of poor in this parish, and that's an interesting aspect. That, and he says that they're increasing daily, the number of poor. There are 84 on the roll, poor roll, and there are other indigent persons who also, though not enrolled, receive sympathy from their community. The collections don't amount to much as usual, and so they're struggling along. There are poor here, though, you know, as you might expect with such a small, you know, need for buying your meal later in the year. The health, now this is an interesting one. I hope somebody who's medical might have some clue here, because he says on the one hand that there's no particular distemper of any kind prevalent in this parish, but then he says fevers are frequent. Sometimes they're of a favourable kind, but other times they continue long and carry off great numbers. And then he says infectious and putrid fever early in the winter, last winter, made its way from the north over a tract of different countries, that means part of his, and proved fatal to many. So how did these two reconcile with this up here? He's using a different word, distemper, a word we would often use for animals today. And then he says that the other things, the fevers or a putrid fever, infectious putrid fever, carried off many. Did anybody have any clues how you reconcile these three statements? What would it mean? A distemper? I don't know. But anyway, anybody
It could
has?
be anything from it could be anything from TB right through to pneumonia.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Neil. Yeah, in fact, of course, they didn't know a whole lot about medical matters anyway. Even the doctors didn't know much in those days, did they? So it's unlikely that this makes a lot of sense, really. But you know what he's saying, I guess, is that despite saying that there are not many, particular things that are prevalent, he's saying that in both those other statements that a lot of work carried off in great numbers or fatal to many.
I just looked up putrid fever then, and they're saying typhus is an example of it.
What's that?
I just looked up putrid fever just then, and they're saying typhus is an example of putrid fever.
Uh-huh.
They're talking about extreme things with that, obviously, aren't they?
Fatal to many.
Would be.
Okay.
Language.
Yeah,
Sorry?
Gaelic's prevailing language, as in most areas on the west coast. And it says whether people had no opportunity of learning Gaelic. He's having a dig that there's no schooling again there. An interesting variety of GAIRLOCH Gaelic is it's very specific. Every language has its different accents and uses. And to note that the Gaelic used in Outlander is GAIRLOCH Gaelic. So if you want a little quiz question to impress your friends with that game, the Gaelic is GAIRLOCH Gaelic when you look at Outlander. Okay, curiosities. He says there are many Pictish brochs. Well, Picts didn't build brochs, and we haven't got brochs in GAIRLOCH Parish. So we have plenty of roundhouses, which are Iron Age, and there are a few what they call dunes, but there's no typical broch. And people have argued for long and weary the difference between a dune and a broch, and it's well above my pay grade to do that here. But the Reverend Mackintosh notes Isle Marie was an ancient burial ground, and it was still in use. Indeed, it was in use into the 20th century. There are McLennans, she says, no, there are McLeans buried there. And he said there was a well of salubrious quality, the water of which has been found for ages past, very serviceable to many diseased persons. It was used for curing madness, and there are a lot of traditions that grew up around Isle Marie, the healing well, how to cure madness. There were calls to presbytery, again, complaints in the early part of the 1700s that people were called in front of the Kirk session to explain why they were sacrificing bulls to St. Melrua to cure somebody of madness. The photograph here shows one of the very old gravestones, which are thought to be of Norse origin. There's quite a lot of Norse and Viking place names in GAIRLOCH Parish. The Vikings began to explore around the area in the 8th century, encouraged by the richness of the monasteries in Britain and Ireland and their lack of defence. There were strongholds established in the Northern Isles and from where plundering expeditions set out. Now, the place names, mostly to start with, there were navigation aids. Ben this and Ben that is a Norse name for a mountain, Ven. But the one that I like the most is Cape Wrath. It's nothing to do with the arguably the roughness of the water around Cape Wrath, which is on the northwest corner of Scotland. It means turning point. So if you're rowing from Norway, you're going to have to turn left at Cape Wrath. Otherwise, it's next stop Greenland. So keep going, turn left, and it's all the monasteries and the riches of Ireland and the west coast of Scotland. There are also place names with dale in, Slatterdale, Taladale. The Dala suffix, again, it indicates a dale or a valley. And even if it doesn't definitively indicate settlement, then Tagan near Kinlochew means the infields or the home field near a farmstead. And across Loch Marie on the slopes of Slioch, there's an abandoned settlement called Smearsery, which is a Gallicization of a Norse version of Butter Ridge Shieling, Smuir Erg, and a loan word in Gaelic, Ari. So that's something else to impress your friends at the quiz team with. Bruce.
So this is, we're going to talk about some McLennans now in this parish and things that they did. But just before we do, here's the famous piper, G.S. McLennan. You know, he is probably the most famous writer of piping tunes of a sophisticated level, Pibroch. And he wrote a tune about Loch Marie, you know, so that's a nice thing. That's a picture of him there. That's his ID number. Everybody who's at this meeting should know that name. That will certainly be on the exam, that one. Who was the pipe tune writer that wrote Loch Marie? And there he is. There's his name up there in the corner. George Stewart McLennan, he's called, or known as GS. Everybody, the pipers, they all call him just GS. There are a lot of, as we said in the beginning, there are a lot of McLennans in this particular parish. If we look at our database now and we look at the births there were in this sort of time scale we're talking about, as we always do, the decade after 1800 of how many births there were, because we know deaths are completely unreliable, we can't even get them. Marriages are very dodgy. So if we look at births, that's as good as we can get. And we can see that this piece of pie here is so much bigger than the next lot. You know, these are the intermediate ones, and then you've got the middling. But, you know, GAIRLOCH just stands out well above the rest. Huh? And I looked at the pie charts. These statistics are available to you from the left-hand menu on the genealogy page, clan stats. And you can just go in there. It's dynamically generated as you ask for it. So it takes a little bit of time sometimes to go away and calculate the answer. And you can put your mouse over it and get this percentage and so on. But look at that, top of the pops for that decade. And I looked at the other decades going on, and GAIRLOCH remains there apart from one case until the 1870s. It's the biggest parish by birth rating that we have in our database. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? Just looking at the sort of overall numbers in all years, you know, we don't have a lot of people after 1900-ish. So up to 1900-ish, we have over 1,000 births in this parish. It counts North GAIRLOCH and South GAIRLOCH for the parts that includes. 400 deaths, you know, obviously some people moved away and died somewhere else, or we don't yet have their death, or they moved overseas or something, and some marriages. We're going to look at a couple of particular McLennans here. This is some stories about these particular people, and this first one has a connection to Baines and Tulloch, which is some names that we saw in the very last meeting that we dealt with. Then we'll look at some Heights people. I'll look at somebody from Diabag and where they went to, and I'll look at and Liz will look at this family here. So looking at Catherine, who comes from that northern part, Laird, you know, we saw there where the old church ruin, roofless ruin was. That's her part of the world. So we're taking some examples from different parts. She was born in about 1817 in GAIRLOCH. And a good thing about her is that she was very thoughtful and died in 1855. Now, you know, anybody want to tell me why it was good that she died in 1855? Come on, you don't know? You know, it was the year that they brought in statutory registration of births, deaths and marriages. So it's a big deal, 1855. But just for 1855 only, that is, they backed down a bit on what they expected. There is much more recording of the details about the person when they died than there was in 1856. You know, you get the place where they were born, you get the children they had, how old they are, you get when they were married, you get who they're married to, you get where they're buried. What else, Chris? You're still muted. There are other things out there. Anyway, you get a lot. That's the long and the short of it. And so we can find out a lot about her life by the thoughtfulness of her dying in. And she was quite early on in that year, and some parishes had not yet adopted the new compulsory registration in the early months of 1855, but fortunately this one had, and so we get a pretty comprehensive death certificate, which you can get by going to her page. The thing that interests me is that there's this connection between the parish that we looked at last time, Dingwall, in that she marries a fellow called John Bain, and they have various Bain children. You can see down the bottom here. You see that? And these first two come to New South Wales. They come to Sydney in 1838, and they set up a estate, really, farming estate in Port Macquarie, or near Port Macquarie, a place called Warhope. And to this day, there are still references to the GAIRLOCH connections there. The estate that they owned, the very large estate they owned there, was called Letter U. Isn't that good? And the family have names of both Bain and Tulloch in their family middle names and so on, to give this reference back to the connections of the Bains of Dingwall that we saw last time. So I really quite like that story and the connection with our previous meeting. That was Catherine. Now we're going to, would you like to do this one, Liz?
Okay, thank you. Murdo, born in GAIRLOCH in 1757. He occurs in the 1798 register of people able to bear arms. He was the son of Roderick, the heights of Kinlochew. Now, once you look at the heights of Kinlochew, there are dozens of Rodericks and Murdos. The names repeat over and over again as the various generations, and it can get really confusing. He marries an Annabel Mackenzie, and children start to be born from 1801. By the census of 1841, he's a sheep farmer in the Heights, and his headstone is in Kinlochew Cemetery. So and that's the type of house he would have lived in at the Heights. That's up at Lecky. That's one of the 1840s houses that, as the Kinlochew estate and the GAIRLOCH estate began to improve the housing of their tenants, they built these substantial properties.
So the estate built those for the tenants.
Well, the tenants built them, but they were encouraged by the estate. Yes. Mm-hmm. So the tumble down dry stone buildings are then replaced with the different ashlar blocks and lintels and very substantial houses. And this house had a slate roof in its latest configuration.
Mhm. And chimneys.
And chimneys that weren't hanging lums, yes.
Yeah.
Chimneys attached to the gable ends.
Mhm. Is one of these houses on the front here the same as this one? No. These are Becky houses, maybe. Maybe that's it there.
Yeah, that's looking from this house up towards Lecky House, which is where Ferguson, who we mentioned earlier, Ferguson of the coffin and the whiskey.
Yeah.
That's where he lived.
Yeah, good. And this is the book that you can get from the clan histories. If you go in there, you can find this book and read it online. Liz's book, generously donated by Liz. And she's worked out who all the Rodericks were, Liz, isn't that right?
I did at one time, yes. Don't ask me to repeat it, but I've got it on a big piece of paper somewhere. It comes out on holidays and holidays, right?
I'm just going to talk briefly about this Kenneth, who, because we're going to the other side of the parish, down on the Applecross side of it. This is a bit of a tribute, really, to one of our esteemed clan members who died only in the last couple of weeks. And that's the husband of Barbara, who's the president of our Canadian Clan Association. Her husband is descended from this family in that we believe lived at least for some time in Diabag before they emigrated to the Maritimes in Canada. And from there, they went to PEI, in fact, and from PEI they went on to Bruce County in the western side of Ontario, where heaps of McLennans are there, heaps of Scots are there. But one of the family, who was the second child, was already married before the rest of the family moved on to Ontario. He stayed on for a little while in Middle River on Cape Breton, and then took one of the ships that were so famous, taking people to Waipu in New Zealand eventually. Well, he went straight to Waipu, but there were some who'd gone earlier. He went on the Spray in 1853 to Waipu. And you probably remember there was the story about the initial boat that set out to take MacLeod and co to the New World. Well, really to Adelaide they were going to originally. He was built at Cape Breton by Murdoch Mackenzie from GAIRLOCH, and his brother, I should remember, Duncan maybe. And this Murdoch McLennan was taking freight up and down from Waipu to Auckland, and unfortunately this fellow Farker went overboard. It's said in Bream Cove, which is the water just off Waipu, and was drowned only a couple of years after he arrived. And by that time he had quite a large family. I remember first discovering his wife's obituary in the paper in 1926, she died. He went overboard and drowned in 1862. So she lived for a long time as a widow. And that's the sort of story of this family that came from Diabag. She, the wife here, was from Applecross, a part called Lonbain, which is not so much where the village of Applecross is, but further up the coast towards Torridon. A fairly desolate sort of place today, Lonbain. So this family from Diabag had descendants all over the world. You can see here some in Detroit, some in Wisconsin, New Zealand, you know, and so on. And it's a bit of a tribute to Barbara's husband, John, who sadly died not only a few weeks ago. Liz.
Thank you. Now, my next piece is about the family of Donald McLennan. He was born in GAIRLOCH Parish in 1831, the youngest child of Roderick McLennan and Anne Mackenzie, who tenanted part of the Heights of Kinlochewe. They lived at the Heights until just before 1871, when he married Margaret MacLean, also from Gairloch, probably from Letter U, the family up there. And later that year, the couple emigrated to Canada, along with a sister, Catherine. Their eldest child, Alexander, was born in the York district of Toronto in October 1871. We'll come back to Alexander in a minute. But Donald is described on the registration document as a farmer, but he was not the informant of the birth. That was a Roderick McLennan, who may have been a cousin and who had emigrated previously, paving the way for other members of the family. So that's an example of chain migration. One person of the family goes and then another and another. However, Catherine at least was so desperately homesick that the family returned to Scotland before their second child was born. They settled in the parish of Urry in 1873. Therefore, this particular bit of the family is an example of failed emigration. However, that was not the end of their wanderings, and their second child, Roderick, was the first of his generation to emigrate. He's listed aboard the ship, the John Elder, which sailed to South America on the 5th of August, 1891. And he was responding to these sort of adverts that came in the Scottish newspapers for estancias being developed in Patagonia. So that's shepherds wanted for the Straits of Magellan. Married couples, no children, and single men. 5 years engagement, wages £50 rising to £60, free passage. Grant and Company were emigration agents for numerous places, and they ranged over a long number of years in Inverness. So that's just above an advert for Shepherds for Canada. So I'm looking at why Patagonia was such an interesting and a place to go, rather than when Canada and America and Australia were still taking emigrants. So Roderick unfortunately had a very short career as a Patagonian shepherd. He died in Punta Arenas, Sandy Point, in December 1896. There's some evidence that he was killed by the indigenous people who were being displaced by the settlers in order to run sheep on the traditional hunting lands. I can have the next slide, please. Alexander, the chap who'd been born in Toronto, the eldest brother, followed Roderick to the sheep farms of Patagonia in 1895. And in 1896, the year his brother was killed, Alexander was engaged as a foreman in Estancia Primavera in Argentina, the first large sheep ranch established by the Jose Menendez in Argentine sector of Tierra del Fuego. The flocks of sheep were suffering repeated losses from the local native population, the tribe of the Selknam. This led to retaliation on the part of the affected ranch owners and the managers. Several men gained a reputation for their murderous ways, among them being Alexander, who was given the nickname Chancho Colorado, the red pig. Rumours circulated that substantial rewards were paid for each native killed, a severed ear being presented as proof. Although latterly it was worked out that you could probably still live without an ear, so the decision was made to lop off another appendage that would, with some certainty, lead to a confirmable death. It was supposed that all the ranching companies condoned this genocide in greater or lesser degree, although publicly they encouraged the Argentine and Chilean authorities to transplant the natives out of harm's way. for example, to put them on an island, Dawson Island, which was run by an order of Salesian priests. The little tie pin that you see there next to Alexander's photograph sheds an interesting light on this period. It's made of green glass, probably from a bottle, and it's an arrowhead. Supposedly the arrowhead that injured him when he was shot in the back in 1897. He's also got a pocket watch gifted to him by Jose Menendez in 1907 for being a good assistant on his retirement. So Alexander's behavior towards the indigenous people may have been triggered by the murder of his brother Roderick, the attack on himself, or the herd excuse that everyone was doing it. He certainly entered the Patagonian folklore, and there's even a heavy metal song about one of the massacres, so check it out on YouTube, Chancho, Colorado. He did send lots of money home to the family in Scotland. It's difficult to know from this extent of years how much he was involved and how much has been accredited to him as a scapegoat for other people's atrocities. The next slide, please. And John and Donald. John McLennan, another brother, was born in Urry, 1833, and he migrated to Vancouver in British Columbia in 1904 when he became a real estate broker, and he died in 1927. And could I have the next slide, please?
Oh.
No, this is not Donald, this is Francisco, Donald's grandson. Donald was the youngest brother of the family, born in Urry in 1889. He would have very little recollection of his elder brother Roderick, who left in 1891. And he was very small when Alexander left in 1895. But Alexander came back to Scotland on at least one occasion. A return trip was built into the contracts of most of the larger estancias. And in 1908, Alexander and Donald were listed as passengers on board the Orita out of Liverpool, bound for Punta Arenas. While Alexander spent his working life in the large company estancias, Donald worked for the independents. He was the only brother in Patagonia to marry and have children, and he died in 1936 in Argentina. Donald and Margaret, to complete the family, had one other son, Murdo, who died in infancy, and a daughter died as a young girl. But two other daughters remained in Scotland and married, and I believe their descendants are members of the Clan Society. Can I have the next slide, please? GAIRLOCH Museum. Right, plug for GAIRLOCH Museum. This was opened, well, the new building was opened in 2019 after a long number of years. The building itself is an anti-aircraft bunker. It was built during the Cold War as a housing for administration and looking out for nasty people who are going to attack us. But it's ideal as a museum because the walls are really, really thick and we can control the environment very well. Princess Anne opened it in July 2019, and I was very fortunate to be presented to her there as part of the team that got the museum going and one of the trustees. A little aside, I had to nip out really quickly after being presented to her, because I then had to rush to the radio station where I'm also a director to receive her there and show her around that. And I got, as she stepped out of her car and I was presented to her at the museum, she said, "Haven't I just seen you at the radio station?" She said, "I haven't just seen you at the museum." So yes, we had one of those little moments.
Oh, that was my sister. But tell us about the podcasts and so on, the YouTube things like the.
Over the pandemic, especially, GAIRLOCH Museum has had a whole range of talks online and introducing people from all over the world to various aspects of the museum, and there are a lot of talks now available online, and there are still talks being broadcast live. There's one coming up on Wednesday, which I shall plug. It's about a golden talk from the Bronze Age that was dredged up by scallop divers or scallop dredger in the Minch between Lewis and GAIRLOCH. 2009, 1996, if my memory serves me correctly. So that's coming up on Wednesday evening at 7:30 UK time.
But you can also just watch the old ones, can't you? On like there's that one about the Mackenzies of GAIRLOCH that was recently.
That's a very good one.
She's so knowledgeable, the curator.
Yes, yeah, we are very fortunate to have a splendid curator there.
Next.
Okay, next. Oh, this is the Dixon, fabulous man Dixon. Available from the museum, a reprint of the book.
John Henry, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a thick book, it's not to be sneezed at. I'm not quite sure how much it costs, but it's 430 pages. And
it's £25.
Yeah, and I guess the postage to wherever you happen to live.
Yeah.
And, are they in stock, do you think, Liz?
In stock, always in stock.
Good. It was a collaborative thing, wasn't it, with the Lairds and Dixon? Isn't that how it worked? They funded the printing of the book or something.
I think so. Yes.
Originally. Yeah. And I should give a plug to this wonderful book here by a famous author. Things she couldn't say herself. You can just go there and look up. It's linked to so many Rodericks just for a start, without all the others. You can go there to our clan database and look up. You just go to the line histories in the front page, and then just put in Heights or Kinloch or something, and you'll get it. Or just scroll through. There are about 40 or 50 books there now. I think 41 that you can read. And this one's been just recently converted over to the new method that does not involve having Adobe Flash. It's not only you might like to say a bit more, Liz, about the wonderful book. You've read it yourself, I understand.
Yeah, here and there. Yeah.
What about national and international economic trends? Tell us about that side of the book.
Oh,
it's your chance.
I haven't read it recently.
No, it's good. It's really a great thing. And, it's got so many families in there, particularly McLennans. It's really a great resource that we have. And we're very grateful to Liz for the work she did to put that in and for making it available to us. Thank you, Liz.
No problem.
Let's turn our microphones on now and see what we can come up with. Just, we're running short of time. So just a couple of points, if somebody would like to give us one each of advantages that you might think this parish has as a place to set up camp if you were a person living in the 1790s. Bill, you got something?
I thought when I read those notes,
yep,
it appeared to be a bit of a struggle town because they grew enough grain for 8 or 9 months and then they had to rely on fishing, and they had cattle and So it seemed to me they were a real struggle area.
What about advantages? So we're doing advantages first. I think you can.
Advantages, are we? Oh.
Well, you start with the positive, you know.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't sort of think along those lines. I just read it, and then I got straight on the line, and the thing was starting. So I didn't actually think about it much.
What about the other Bill McLennan? Were you going to say?
Peaceful, very peaceful then.
Peaceful?
Peaceful, yeah. There doesn't seem much rebellions going on around there at the time, like, and plenty of beautiful views for anybody that wants to come into the area.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't hear the exact amount you said, Bruce, but you did say that the export of cod.
Cod, yeah, 30 to 40,000.
That would have been a good money maker, I think.
Learner. Yep, good learner. 30 to 40,000 cod a year are exported out of the parish.
Yeah. The other thing, I think, which Liz talked about, the iron making going back, you know, to the Iron Age, as she said.
Mm-hmm.
If you take a place like Sweden today, Sweden's really a bit like Australia, that we're living high on the export of iron ore product.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, iron ore has always been a money maker. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was a decent economy around that as well.
You know, I tried to look up, David, the sort of the two things. They either made hammered iron, like a blacksmith, or they had hammer, you know, things like a rock crusher in a mill, but also they made cast iron things. That's how cannon were made, I gather, you know, cast. And during the 1700s, this period we're talking about, the evolution of artillery, you know, even to forming a first artillery unit in the early 1700s, to having failed to capture the French fort at Quebec City in the late 1600s, to having the advantage of artillery to be able to capture it after Culloden. You know, these are all important. It's a whole world of, you know, artillery stuff, and to develop the barrels to such a point where they wouldn't explode in your face, or they could be light enough to carry from one place to another, or to put on ships to move around, to relocate, you know, point in a different direction. We're all very important developments.
Liz also mentioned the technology of blast furnaces coming in, you know, where you're blasting oxygen into the fire to get the temperatures up to make higher quality material.
Carbon. And
also the mixing of carbon into it to make a better quality. So I'm not sure, Liz, when did you say that technology came into the area?
It's about 1607.
Yeah, so it's quite a while then that it's going on in the area. Yeah.
There's a great blast furnace at Bon Or, which is out in the back blocks of Oban. If you ever get a chance to go there, when we went there was no other soul to be seen, but it's such a fabulous place. You know, it's got a big forest up the back to supply the timber to make the charcoal, and then they have a water wheel to drive some bellows, David. It's really a great attraction to go there and see how they did it. As Liz says, quite a long while after this one was in operation, but it's a more working model there at Bon Or. Great thing. Yeah. So that's the advantages. Any more advantages, Malcolm?
Yeah, I'd have thought that the growth in the population after 1800, the doubling of the population, must have been as a result of, you know, perceived advantages anyway. I noticed my ancestor, at least I think it is my ancestor, was a tailor, and I wondered what the role of a tailor might have been in a very small population, and with the fishing influence, I wondered if they doubled as sailmakers and the like.
All right.
So
It's interesting. Yeah. A lot of those places had bootmakers, you know, and tailors, or because they weren't transporting it in from anywhere else. If you wanted to have something to wear, you had to either make it yourself or have a tailor make it for you.
guess so.
They didn't get it from China, you know what I mean?
I think if you can,
Just to give another
I
plug
think
to
if
the
you get
museum, they,
places,
sorry,
Linda.
the museum, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. They have examples of knitting there from GAIRLOCH. I'm sure Liz knows more about it than I do, but yeah, there is quite a lot of knitting was done locally in the crofts, which would have provided some cloth and costume, I think, for the people living there. There were one of the Lady GAIRLOCHs, one of the Lady Mackenzies, introduced knitting to some of the women in GAIRLOCH Parish to increase the income. And there's a special GAIRLOCH pattern. If any of you ladies or gentlemen are knitters, you can get a pattern of the GAIRLOCH pattern from the museum. And apparently it's fiendishly difficult, but it's been transcribed, or whatever you do, to knitting patterns. Again, it's out of my league. And you can now buy them from the GAIRLOCH Museum and knit your own in the GAIRLOCH pattern, whatever you fancy. And there are lots of hand loom weavers in the district as well, so they'd be producing cloth that your tailors would be using.
Now, what are some of the disadvantages? We've talked about the advantages. What about disadvantages?
I would think, coming into the late 18th century, you've got the for things like ironworks, you're competing with the infrastructure in the borders and in England, where they have the canals and so many factories and everything close at hand. All the manufacturing is going on down there. The costs of moving it from Lochmarie or around the coast must have had, and the quality of the iron ore, was that good enough to sustain the business? In later times, the iron ore was brought in a higher grade, but the whole industrial complex was really finished by about the 1720s. So it's pre the Industrial Revolution. Getting set up.
Lack of education would be a disadvantage, wouldn't it? That's what we've heard today. Anything else?
How about that blacking ceremony for newlyweds? I'm not quite sure if it's a disadvantage or an advantage, actually. It sounds a bit of fun, but not if you want to look your best on your wedding day.
You get scrubbed down before then.
Not just the feet either.
Actually, Liz, is that particular custom, is that confined to GAIRLOCH, or is it a general Scottish custom?
No, it's a Scottish-wide thing.
Yeah. I thought I'd heard
yeah.
I like the funeral one though. I think that was quite nice, sitting on the casket and things.
Well, it saves you getting wet, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's good.
Pass the bottle round. Well, there you go. That's a few things there. Don't forget, you can always look up the McLennan Places book. It's free there online. You can download it from the dark menu on the left-hand side of the genealogy page, and you can look up the GAIRLOCH Parish in chapter 7. The idea of it is, of course, that each of the places that are mentioned have the hyperlinked map coordinates, so you can use your Google Maps or whatever to direct you to the place that you're interested in going to, whether you're driving there or walking there. And you know, different places you might get out of your car, and you can use the book on your phone to walk to the location that you're interested in. So just reviewing what we've seen today, I hope that as a result of today's session, you've been able to understand a bit more about the topography of the GAIRLOCH Parish, where it is in relation to the other parts of Scotland and other parishes, how big it is and what sort of things are produced there, who the heritors and the minister are, something about the numbers of people who live there, what they do for source of income, other ways, what they're like, and health, housing, some of the McLennans who came from there, and just a few curiosities to tickle your interest.